Today I'll be doing a brake fluid change on my 2013 Mazda 3. The dealership price of this work was $176, taxes included. I'm going to see if I can beat that today. For this I'll be using some shop towels, some .3 brake fluid, specially formulated for Asian vehicles, gloves, a brake bleeder kit, and some metric wrenches, specifically the 10 and 9 millimeter wrench. First thing I'm going to do is remove the brake fluid reservoir cap and just let it sit on top of the reservoir to allow air to come into the system and push the brake fluid out. The bleeder kit's nothing special, just a bottle, and you could make one yourself. It comes with a magnet. Because I'm doing this on a sloped driveway, I've got my car on ramps. And I'm going to start with the rear passenger side tire. Here's a look at it. I'm going to remove the black rubber covering on the bleeder screw. And for this first nipple I had a little bit of an issue removing it, so I couldn't use a wrench. It was frozen in there pretty good. So I'm going to start this one with a socket, and this is not how I did the other ones, as you'll see. Once it's loose, I hooked up the brake bleeding kit to the bleeder screw and attached the magnetic bottle above the bleeder screw, and that is to ensure that any air in the system is pushed out while you're pumping your brakes, and the air travels upwards into the bleeder kit bottle. As you pump the brakes, you can see quite a bit of air coming out initially, and eventually just clear fluid will come out. After the brake pedal is depressed approximately 7 or 8 times, this small bottle became full of brake fluid, and that's my sort of one negative comment about the bottle, is that it did fill up quickly and I did have to drain it frequently. For the first brake, which is the rear passenger side, I had to run quite a lot of brake fluid through the system before clear new brake fluid was coming out, and I did have to fill that OEM bottle about 8 or 9 times. So as you're doing the brake fluid flush, you need to continually add brake fluid into the reservoir at the top end. If it goes dry, you could have air introduced into the system, and you'll have to do a longer flush. So essentially, I let it get down to about a quarter full and then fill it back up and continue this process. Now, because this brake bleeder screw was a bit frozen on, I was unable to keep the system in place, and rather I had to disconnect everything and then use the ratchet again to tighten the bleeder screw, which is not the procedure I'm going to be doing for the other tires. However, just because this bleeder screw was so frozen in there, I was unable to use the wrench. You may find it easier to remove the tires, but for this I wanted to do it with the tires on. Once your bleeder screw is tight, just take the rubber cover again and reinstall it on the bleeder screw. So this is the front driver's side brake. First thing I do is loosen the bleeder screw, and this time it's going to be using a 9 millimeter wrench. I'm not entirely sure why they have 10 millimeter in the back and 9 millimeter in the front. However, that is the case. So I'm going to attach the bleeder kit to the bleeder screw, and I will then loosen the bleeder screw to allow the brake fluid to begin to move out of the system and into the brake bleeding kit. Because I've already bled the rear passenger side brake, this will take a lot less time to get all the brake fluid out of this one. Prior to pumping the brakes, I'm going to ensure that there is still enough brake fluid up in the reservoir that it will not run dry while I'm doing the brake fluid flush on the driver's side brake. For the front driver's side brake, I ran approximately 8 of those OEM bleeder kit bottles of brake fluid through the system. So to remove the bleeding kit, first I tightened the bleeder screw while ensuring that there was no bubbles, air bubbles in the hose leading to the bleeder kit to make sure that all the air was out of the system. Once the bleeder screw is tight, I then removed the brake bleeding kit so as to ensure that there was no bubbles in the system. One point to note, I did use the shop towels to ensure that there was no brake fluid on the brake caliper, so that when I was doing the brake flush on the remaining calipers, I would notice if any brake fluid was seeping out of that bleeder screw, and I could make sure that there's no leakage later on. And the last thing to do is just put on the small rubber cap. So moving to the rear driver's side, remove the rubber cap from the bleeder screw, attach the brake bleeder kit, and secure the bottle above the bleeder screw with the magnet. Open the bleeder screw valve to allow the brake fluid to flow from the caliper and into the brake bleeding kit, and then depress the brake pedal in the cab of the vehicle again 7 or 8 times to fill the bottle, and essentially just repeat the process. Once complete, again leaving the brake bleeding kit attached to the bleeder screw, just tighten the screw, ensuring that there's no air in the line to potentially go back into the brake caliper. Once the bleeding screw has been sufficiently tightened, then you can remove the brake bleeding kit, and with some shop rags or paper towel, just clean up whatever mess remains. If required, you can also, snug the bleeder screw up once you're sort of got everything removed, and then just take the small rubber nipple and put it back on the brake caliper. And the final one to do here is obviously the front passenger side. Again, using a 9mm wrench, attach the bleeding kit, open the bleeding screw. Once that's done, brake fluid will flow into the system, and then really it's just a repeat of the same process. Depressing the brake pedal approximately 8 times will fill that small bottle, and sort of once you've got that initial brake fluid out of the system, it takes again about 8 bottles to get new brake fluid flowing through. All the steps are the same for the removal of the brake bleeding kit. Now, the last thing you're going to want to do is refill your brake fluid reservoir. So take your .3 brake fluid and fill it right up to the fill line. Throughout the week, I would recommend periodically checking it to make sure that you're not losing any brake fluid, as well as look at the bleeding screws on your brake calipers to ensure that they're not leaking any fluid. For this job, I paid $32 for the 2 bottles of brake fluid and $13 for the bleeding kit, for a total of $45. The dealership price again was 176 Canadian, so that gave me a $131 savings over the dealership. Finally, I always take the empty fluid to a reuse center, so I use the empty bottles to use as the container to pour the old fluid into, and I'll take those back for free at the eco station later. Thanks for checking out my video, and don't forget to like and subscribe.